Thank you all very much. I hope that freed up your mind slightly. Another way that we trying to free up people's minds slightly in this session is you will notice that you are sitting in a slightly less in a slightly different arrangement. We thought that when people talk about politics, it's kind of a good idea to see human faces. Rather than backs of human heads and a panel up on a dais saying stuff. And so I should reassure you that if any of you thought that you had been assorted in some strange way into groups that would then be required to do some horrible audience participation, depending on where you were sitting, that is not our idea. There is no significance to which corner of the room you are sitting in, rather than whether you're seeing my back or my face at any given time. In further news, I wanted to get this out of the way first. Some of you may be aware that today the steering committee has distributed another statement in counter-distinction, I think, not necessarily opposition to the statement that was distributed on Monday. There are copies of that statement around, I think, at the back there. There was a copy there. If you want to go and get it, there will be copies all around the place. This is a statement drafted by Clive Hamilton. It will be discussed to some extent at the town hall meeting that we're having to discuss the first statement, which will be at 5 o'clock tonight in this very room. So if you just want to go to sleep all afternoon and wake up and have another political discussion then, that's your option. So that's enough for that sort of housekeeping. To say a little bit about what we're hoping to do in this hour-long session. This session comes out of two panels that were held yesterday and today on the politics of climate geoengineering. We're trying to use this more relaxed but intensive format to get a lot of people thinking about these political issues. We're also trying to slightly broaden the debate in the sense that we're not enforcing this, but we are trying to have a discussion that does not quickly make use of either the concept of moral hazard or the concept of governance. These are, of course, very important issues, but we feel that political discussions of geoengineering have a tendency to get to those issues and move no further, and it might be nice occasionally to look at the broader political context. And so we're going to be doing this in we're going to be trying to draw out some ways that thinking about geoengineering fits into or contrasts with other ways of thinking about the politics of the climate. And so the format that we have is that 4 people who took part in those panel discussions are going to speak briefly, and then we're going to just throw it open to a general discussion. There is one other innovation that I haven't mentioned, partly because I don't fully understand it. But if for any reason you are feeling inhibited, despite everything we're doing to try and avoid that, there is a way that you can tweet your contribution to this discussion. If you tweet it to #LunchCEPoly. You will have your question discussed, it says here, because it will magically arrive on my, it will probably magically arrive on my iPad, which is telling me this. So if that is the way in which you want to participate in this discussion, you should feel utterly free to do that. And that's probably enough freedoms or strictures lightly disguised as freedoms to be going on with. Our first speaker is Duncan. If he wants you to know where he's from, he'll tell you. He's going to talk about justice and other forms of real politics. This comes out of some of the discussion from yesterday morning's Politics and Climate Engineering panel. So, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Ollie. I'm Duncan McLaren, and I'm from the planet Earth. It's rare for Earth politicians to engage with climate engineering, but that doesn't mean that there's not lots of politics in climate engineering. Yesterday morning, we heard, for instance, from Anders Hansen about the massive level of a common narrative in media discourses of political failure, that politicians, political processes had failed to deliver mitigation, and that it was much more realistic, therefore, to consider climate engineering. And that's a narrative we've heard plenty of times in this very room and in this conference. It's an example of what some people are calling post-political narratives, post-political responses. And another example of that, or in the climate engineering case, that's saying we need something which has low cost and big leverage and can be done outside of the conventional political systems. This view is not limited to climate engineering. We see it in Silicon Valley, where there's a politics of big data, big profits, big philanthropy to try and solve social and political problems, ignoring the government except as a possible consumer of what Silicon Valley produces, and that's regardless of the amount of investment governments have made in the infrastructure and the research that allows all of that to happen. So thinking about politics in those dimensions. That implies a distrust of politics amongst certain rich elites. But distrust of politics is much more widespread. We heard from Rose Cairns also yesterday morning talking about the politics of chemtrails and chemtrailers who feel betrayed and distrustful in government. It's a different model, but both of those see an undermining of any sense of politics as a collective negotiation over how we as humans should live together on this planet. Chemtrailers' concerns about secrecy, vested interests, and ideas that politics is becoming more personal are actually shared in key ways by wider publics. I presented some work on UK engagement studies which showed similar themes coming up in public deliberation of climate engineering. For these publics, the sense of justice and injustice intersects and structures people's views on climate engineering. The resistance to vested interests and profiteering, and indeed a resistance to the idea that once again we are creating a means to dump our rich world problems on the poorer people of the developing world, is palpable in those public discussions. Those mental models are political, whether you think of politics as something about class or something about identity. Different groups, different identities bring different interests with different consequences for what they want climate engineering to deliver or fear it will deliver if allowed. For example, some supporters come to it as the last refuge in a process of denialism, fighting against mitigation. Others have come to it very clearly, exhausted from a long struggle, apparently futile, to get and win mitigation. Very different interests. Neither of those will understand necessarily where the opposition comes from those who see climate engineering threatening their identity as women, their identity as members of a particular cultural group, or indeed their identity as humans standing in a particular relationship to the planet Earth. So in conclusion, we need to look beyond party politics, beyond governments, and beyond the formal institutions and mechanisms of governance when we talk about the politics of climate engineering. There's been some talk in recent weeks on the Google groups about governance. Some people have even used the word govern-nonsense. They've said, we need to get down to the real technology. Now, I'm frustrated with talk of governance in the abstract, but not for that reason, for a different reason. It's true we need to grapple with real technology. Governance will be co-produced between those working with technology and those working with politics. But we need to grapple more urgently with real politics, the concerns and aspirations of publics around the world, and the ways political actors and vested interests are seeking to co-opt and reframe climate engineering in ways that typically reinforce and reproduce the power relations that underlie climate injustice that we face already. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Next up, we have Olaf, who will talk a little bit about ways in which we can expand climate engineering politics out into climate politics and see changes as a result of doing so.
Thank you, Ollie, and thanks, Duncan. It's difficult to add much to that very comprehensive and flowing account from the panel. I didn't realize it was that gripping, actually, when I was in the panel. But
It was good.
It was good, good. Well, there was actually a member of our panel who did talk about moral hazard, and I don't want to make that taboo either, but Nick Pidgeon was telling us about his research on and looking into three different kinds of moral hazard, the individual, social, and political. But as this as the agenda is slightly different today, I just want to give an example from our panel, which was my paper, I must confess, of how to broaden the discussion away from just governance and official institutions and international law into a wider political issue. In fact, rather than going beyond it, I think I want to talk about a way of analyzing it below, and to look at what the basic grammar or rules of a political system is, or an issue, and how issues can move between different grammars. So you can have a normal democratic political rule where everything can be discussed, and we just debate whether to do things about something or not, an issue. But there are other categories of politics, and securitization is often used quite loosely in the debate about geoengineering as well. And being an IR scholar, I have a particular theoretical understanding of what securitization is, and that's usually defined as positing an existential threat to a valued object in order to legitimate some extreme measures that wouldn't normally have been considered. And my question is, what bearing would various kinds of geoengineering have for the possibility of affecting a securitization? So if people want to move this issue into the security category, and people talk a lot about the emergency framing and things like that, and people are very worried about it for the very same reason, how would various forms of geoengineering change the conditions of possibility for securitizing climate politics in a wider sense? So not just geoengineering techniques, but what effect, what spillover effect would it have as that logic if it did become easier to securitize climate change if geoengineering was being either prepared for or even deployed? And
excuse me, what is securitized?
to securitize something, in my understanding, is to shift an issue into the security category. So you turn it into a security issue, giving it and making it subject to a certain grammar of security, which is about extreme, exceptional measures. So, for example, if something has been securitized, it becomes legitimate, it becomes possible to use extreme or otherwise not acceptable measures such as violence, war, secrecy, all the things that national security, for example, you're allowed to have secret services, you have government rules about secrecy. You're allowed to circumvent the normal rules of politics, basically. So anything can actually go into a security category, can be securitized in theory. Not just military threats from other countries, but other kind of things that people manage to securitize in terms of depicting them as existential threats to some kind of valued object, whether that's national security or environmental sustainability or public health or something like that. So that's how we talk about it in IR, at least. So energy security, if you securitize the energy supply, you're allowed to set aside the normal rules of politics. It doesn't become something that we can deal with if we want. We can leave it out. No, if it's a security issue, we've got to deal with it, and we can do just about anything we
You're
want.
allowed to invade Iraq.
For example.
And who does the securitization?
Well, not everybody has the same potential for doing that. I wouldn't be able to securitize a threat from Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction because people wouldn't listen to me. But other people were able to do that in certain positions of power. So the ability to securitize is also dependent on the authority of the speaker and the position of the speaker.
Would it be fair to say, roughly speaking, that the power to securitize is currently largely sequestered by governments? I mean, it's a political power pretty much.
Pretty much, but there are other actors who actively try to securitize
Sure.
all the time. Most of the time, it is people already in positions of power who are able to do that. The other thing, so you have to have people who are in the right position to do it, but you also have to have some facilitating conditions. There has to be something that makes it plausible that you can convince an audience that this issue should be moved into this special category. And my question is then, what do geoengineering techniques do to those conditions of possibility for moving stuff into the security category? And my argument is that a lot of geoengineering techniques I don't think have potential for securitization, but some of them do. And the ones that do are the ones that shorten the causal chain of harm significantly, and also the ones that introduce intentionality, so that it becomes much easier to posit an enemy. There's a threatening other. There is somebody doing something harmful. There is an existential threat to us or something. And so my paper looked at whether SRM would make it easier, all things being equal, to securitize climate politics. And what would that do to the rest of climate politics, which, for all its faults, has not been plagued by a securitized logic. The cause of harm has been so dispersed and sort of aggregated that it's been difficult to actually securitize. People have tried all the time, used very dramatic language about weather of mass destruction and Al Gore invoking the Second World War as a metaphor and things like that. But nobody's been able to suggest any extreme measures. So it hasn't legitimated any extreme measures. But with SRM, I think if we imagine a world where we're deploying this and extreme weather is happening, as is probable, as it always does, it becomes politically easier to securitize the whole field of climate politics. And that, I think, is a different question to moral hazard, which is about people's motivations, whether we get demotivated by the appearance of an alternative. It's about changing the fundamental logic of the politics of climate change and what the implications of that are. I better stop there.
That's great. Thank you very much, Olaf. Can I, Sean, are you? Yes, please, clap. Can I deputise you to tell people who come in late that there is no problem with just walking down here? Because I'm just gesturing at them and feeling like a lunatic. Our next speaker, who was one of the coordinators of this morning's session, is Matthias, who also put together this lunchtime chat session. And we're now going to move into a way of looking at things from a slightly more institutional structure. So Matthias is going to say something about what went on in the Where Do We Discuss This session that went on this morning. Latecomers, please move on through.
Thanks very much, Ollie. So I'm going to show the one and only slide in this session, rest reassured. And that's because I tried to summarize some of the points that were discussed this morning in the previous session in order to give a context to this discussion. And afterwards, I want to focus more on the process side of things. I have those three terms, politics, governance, and process or negotiations, that are somewhat interlinked. Most people have a different understanding of them, and I want to put the focus on the fluid aspect of those terms. So one issue that came up in this morning's sessions, which is debatable, is the need for multilateralism on climate engineering. There's aspects that can be drawn from the UNFCCC process, which is sort of the angle that I'm taking on this, that call for a transfer of the principles that are applied under the UN Convention on Climate Change, which are notably equity and maybe the concept of sustainable development as well. And many more, as it says there, in terms of effectiveness, affordability, or timeliness, which are all aspects that have called for specific developments of tools like carbon markets to evolve, which may or may not actually have to play a role also in the rollout of CDR technologies if we choose to use them, specific ones. And a different aspect is civil society participation, which is something that has played a pretty dominant role, a pretty co-shaping role in the UNFCCC process, and somewhat relating to transparency and legitimacy in that process. The financing of carbon mitigation aspect through carbon market mechanisms I already mentioned. And one aspect which I tried to convey this morning was that I would say many of the critical arguments that are raised in sessions on climate engineering do not necessarily hold. The counter-arguments which I put forward may also not hold. That's granted. But I think it is important to raise this discussion to a different level, a different scope, and to broaden the discussion. And it is in that context that I see a great need for a broader societal discussion on this, to involve more stakeholders, to not have just one NGO, the ETC group, in the case of the CBD decisions, to really shape to a very large extent those decisions, but rather have a whole host of constituencies consisting also of civil society organizations. And this is, from my point of view, in the process, in this fluid perspective of governance or politics of climate engineering, one of the most important issue areas that I think we are at this point in time, where we need to broaden the discussion, and we need to find ways to do that in a neutral and in a constructive way that brings us forward and actually increases our understanding of the societal problem that we have at hand, rather than the technical problem. And I'll leave it at that.
That sounds great. Thank you very much indeed. And lastly, we have some words from Axel, who also spoke in the same group, who I think is going to talk a little bit about how market mechanisms fit into this, but also the broader institutional issues as well.
Yeah, I will not only talk about market mechanisms, but I will talk about a bit of a perspective of somebody who's worked for 20 years in climate policy assessment and who now sees the emergence of a new epistemic community. So the climate engineering community that is knocking at the door of climate policy, and as, of course, anyone growing up making their first steps thinks that, oh yeah, everything should be different. And we've seen this process in the UNFCCC negotiations several times. So initially we had the crowd of people who said, okay, renewable energies, energy efficiency, that will do the trick. We can reduce anthropogenic climate change to a level where it is no longer dangerous. And of course, after about 10, 15 years, this used to wean off. And we had the second wave of people saying, okay, we now need to think about adaptation. And with adaptation, we had a similar situation as with climate engineering now, that the inner core of people working in climate policy thought, oh, it's a bad idea to discuss this openly. It's a distraction from the classical mitigation, so let's keep them outside. But eventually they came in, and now adaptation policy is one crucial policy strand under the UNFCCC. And now I'm seeing the same thing repeating itself for climate engineering. So currently knocking at the door, some people saying, okay, UNFCCC is not the right forum, we do it differently. Eventually, I would say all the talk about alternatives to UNFCCC for climate policy has been in vain. None of the alternatives so far has performed. You read chapter 13 of 5th assessment report of IPCC, which has looked at the literature. So I would expect that eventually emerging of the climate engineering epistemic community and the broader climate policy community that is embodied in the UNFCCC and, of course, the various undercurrents of discussion. So I would hope that we, in the next 5 years, see a growing integration of the valid issues that are discussed by the climate engineering community into the broader strands of the climate policy discussions. Still here in the corridors talking to people, I felt that some people, both from NGOs but also from policy institutions, said, oh, let's keep climate engineering out of UNFCCC stuff until Paris is over. Paris meaning the conference which is to decide on the fate of international climate policy. I think that's maybe not the right strategy, but that we should be aware of the possibilities and limitations of climate engineering in the policy context. We discussed a number of principles in our session this morning. I think that, for example, the debate about equity principles is, of course, crucial in determining how the climate engineering strand can contribute to a broader policy discussion and help us to achieve the common goal of keeping climate change below a dangerous level. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Axel. I'm going to. We could undoubtedly get the 4 speakers to talk to each other, but let's throw it open to the room for a bit. First, do we have a roving microphone, or do we have loud voices? Oh, we have a roving microphone. That's excellent. Could I see some hands for people who want to speak? You, sir, and then you.
I am Eduardo Viola from the University of Brasilia. I just very quickly would like to offer a different perspective on climate politics, not exactly related to the multilateral negotiations. That is, how important are major powers in defining the future of climate engineering. So, in my view, what we have today is three communities of interested, very small in climate engineering, that are the security, intelligence, and defense establishment of the major powers, some corporations funding some research, and the scientific community. Okay, and today the question is still very behind the scenes. But when we'll come in, we will come probably fastly, openly, and this will come in the plurilateral relations between the major powers. And I mean by this, the European Union, United States, Russia, China, Japan, India. South Korea, maybe, countries that have power in the global arena and technological capacity for research and deployment of this will be the politics of geoengineering, in my view, not the wide multilateral negotiations in the United Nations.
Oh, thank you very much. Rafe.
I'm Rafe Pomerantz from Washington. I would like to give a different political perspective on the question of climate engineering, because the tone seems to be there's some form of, I don't know, regulation required of experiments that may or may not, may be trivial in their impact, but because they're associated with geoengineering, they require more oversight. So, taking into account that tone, I would argue that actually what we need is much more vigorous political support for research and for freedom of experimentation. And the reason I think this community of, if you call it, of geoengineering has appeared is because of the objective conditions of the climate system. I mean, we're at 400 parts per million CO2. Even under the best scenarios, the system goes, I don't know, 500, 600. With the best, or at least today's most optimistic scenarios of low-cost technology. So given that, you have to ask yourself, what's the risk of not having a tool to deal with that? I don't know if we have a tool. But I'd sure like to know, because if you look to the Arctic, it's unraveling. So my perspective is we have an urgent climate problem. We need a lot of research to know if there's a useful tool, something that has low risk or not. At the same time, we need to be, the message of that is that we need to be on a much faster path to a carbon-free carbon-free economy. So it's sort of a tonal thing. Are we interested in speeding up our understanding because of the climate crisis? Or are we interested in slowing this down because we fear the consequences of this sort of securitization or whatever? Fine.
So on that basis, does anyone from the distributed panel want to come back on either of those points, or should we move on with some more viewpoints? Does anyone want, Duncan and Axel, right, I took 2 points there very particularly, the small group narrow multilateralism versus broad group multilateralism that comes from looking at the objective technological capabilities of major powers, and also the idea of politics as something that might be actively involved in accelerating the pace of research. So, Duncan.
Yeah. I think minilateralism or plurilateralism is much more predictable, and that's why it's important to make that a political discussion. And Rafe, thank you for a lovely illustration of the framing of political realism.
I'm leaving it at that. Okay. Axel.
Yeah, on the major power issues, don't overestimate major powers. In the context of mitigation debate, they've been unable to mobilize anything. So I would be very surprised if they now become better in doing this in the context of climate engineering.
Okay, you back there, and then I think you had your hand up, didn't you? Yes, so you and then gentleman with the tie there.
Manfred Reber, Germanwatch. I want to expand on Axel's thinking on the FCCC with 2 points. First, how does FCCC work? We know that the science, it's the entrance door. The FCCC gets the knowledge from science through the IPCC. They make also, every 5 or 7 years, they made assessment reports, and for this new science to intelligence is getting in. And that's why I would heavily suggest that you just focus to go through IPCC to FCCC. So we have the next assessment report, AR6, in 5 or 6 years, and this would be by the time. So we have a lot of scientists here, they publish, and then we'll have an assessment report, and then we could digest this in FCCC. This would be one point. Another point is one experience with FCCC on CCS. Some say CCS is climate engineering, is geoengineering. We had 3 heavy years on the question of including CCS and CDM. It was very, very different. The world was divided, and we had, for such a small question, we have lost 3 years on that. You see, it should begin slowly with this item of climate engineering FCCC. So my suggestion, begin with IPCC and then to FCCC.
Great, thank you very much. You, sir.
Thank you, Ralph Bohl, Ecologic Institute. What I miss in the debate here is, at least as it regards institutions and international governance, what for? Those who argue for a specific regime to be doing governance, what do you want it to do? And many of the arguments in favor or against would depend on that. I haven't heard anything of that, what you would, those who prefer the UNFCCC, for instance, would want it to do, and when. Time frame is the second missing point in these arguments. Anything you would want to do before Paris is simply not realistic, full stop. Secondly, if you want to do it any sort of major governance, you would have to talk into at least 5, 6, 7 years before the issue would even be taken up. So that would need to be addressed by anyone who suggests any sort of international regulation, governance, whatever you might call it. What is it that you want that level to do? Why is it not enough for national governments to do it or other regulatory levels? And which time frame are you talking about? Thank you.
Thank you. I think both Axel and Matthias would like to come back on one or both of those. Axel, why don't you go first?
Yes, on both issues, of course, Manfred is right. There are certain processes, there are timetables. Just my experience having worked in the 5th assessment report, of course, there was a lot of politics behind the scenes about that role that climate engineering should play in the 5th assessment report. So, of course, one would have to have a good and transparent process of discussing this, and sometimes IPCC can be a bit opaque internally. On the second item, of course, there is time frames that need to be taken into account. Manfred is completely right. It took several years to get agreement on CCS in the market mechanisms under UNFCCC due to issues of safeguards, due to issues of how to qualify the resulting credits. But eventually, I think the technical decision that was made in a pragmatic and good sense, and could be a model of how to deal with other technologies that fall under the broad umbrella of climate engineering. So I would say, while one needs to acknowledge these long time frames, they are also a useful, let's say, break that prevents rapid and rush decision making, which is not properly thought through, and that's why it's an important safeguard.
I just want to repeat, people at the back or at the end, let's not be frontist about this, should feel free to move to the other end if they actually want to sit down. We won't mind you walking through. It's not that kind of discussion. Just before you come back, Matthias, I think, Anne, did you want to say something specifically to the IPCC part, because you were also an author on that, so if we could just take that.
So my name is Alan Roebuck. I was a lead author of the IPCC this last time, and we had a special meeting in Lima, Peru about geoengineering so that authors from all three working groups could get on the same page. And then it was actually considered in all three and written about in all three parts of the new IPCC report, which was released last year and earlier this year. The problem with IPCC is that it's a very conservative process, and there was a deadline about a year before it was published that we couldn't consider any new work because we had to stop at some point. So what was written was quite good in the IPCC report, but it's already about 2 years out of date, and there's been a lot of work done since then. There's going to be a meeting in Paris in July, a 4-day climate conference in preparation for the negotiations, in which a lot of science is going to be presented. I'm trying to organize a geoengineering session on solar radiation management for that conference, and so that will then update one more year's worth of work. So we can't really count on what's in the IPCC report because it'll be 2 or 3 years out of date by the time there are these negotiations, and I don't see how it can just be ignored. On the other hand, without an IPCC process, there's lots of different work, and it's hard to know what the consensus is or what's robust. But what the report says right now is that we just have so many questions about solar radiation management and potential dangers that there's no argument to be made now that it could help solve the problems of global warming. So that's sort of the consensus still, I think, that we need mitigation, and we still have questions about how effective or dangerous implementation would be. But I'm not a politician, but I don't see how you can just ignore it and say nothing about it.
Thanks very much, Alan. I think, Matthias, you possibly wanted to come back to the big question of what do you actually want to do if you integrate this climate engineering politics into the broader climate politics?
Well, what do we want to do? What do we want to achieve? That is actually a political choice, a political decision that has to form itself. And I think that blends into a much larger picture, which I would put under the keyword of steering through long time periods. And we got to be honest. All those processes that came up just now, the process of including CCS into the CDM, the process of generating IPCC reports, and the process of generating an international climate agreement, for which the 2015 agreement is just the starting point. We got to be realistic in that sense. And that's precisely why I want to put that under the keyword of steering, because we have to take those long time periods into account when we talk about climate engineering. And we have to think about the fact that when we start a discussion now, and we're really still at a very, very early starting point of that discussion will draw on decades. And that is, I think, undeniable. And I want to underline the point that Axel made, which is if we don't actually build the ground for a mutual understanding of what we are talking about very early on, if we don't start the discussion in all those venues that we have been talking about just now, and possibly many others, also possibly on a more localized level, if we don't do that, society as such will not have the decision-making capability, not have the capacity to deal with the topic in an adequate way once the urgency, if it comes, is there. Once it looks like there is a climate emergency, and there's another session on that issue, because that's a debatable term, obviously, because it's a social construct of sorts. But once that moment arises, and I think you could say, well, I know a climate emergency when I see it, I think that could be a useful definition. Society needs to be ready. And that requires a very long process of opinion information and finding a common language to discuss about the problem.
Gentleman who asked the question, did that seem like an answer to you? Can you give the mic back?
I'm afraid not at all. I'm still asking, what exactly is it that you want the different governance level? What exactly is it that you want the different governance levels to do? Do you want this regime you describe and the UNFCCC that you prefer? Do you want to do what? Authorize, approve any geoengineering experiment? Be the centralized, overarching global institution through which goes everything? Maybe, if that's what you want, make it clear and then explain what that would look like, how long it would take you to set that up. Or do you just want a clearinghouse, a registry for experiments? That might be a completely different function with different timescales, different realistic chances, different chances of being implemented. That I completely miss so far. So I don't think my question has been answered. Thank you.
I'm going to actually ask you to wait for that a bit because we'll pick up a few things. I think Olaf wanted to say something briefly and then the question back there. And other people, if I see hands, I'm more likely to ask you to speak than if I don't see hands. So I might ask you to speak anyway. Who knows? No, the gentleman in the red tie.
I'm afraid this takes you in a different direction now. Andreas Krämer, Ecological Institute, and we didn't agree beforehand that we would speak. And my comment concerns the scope of the debate. The debate about geoengineering and how it fits into policy is premised on two things which I would like to call into question. One is that mitigation is too costly and has failed. When you talk to people in the energy business, they talk about demand destruction. We are at the crossover point of the cost of solar plus storage is now cheaper than nuclear and coal. The industries are expanding rapidly. The change is going to be very fast and ask you to entertain the possibility that in future mitigation will move much faster and therefore we have more time to sort things out. The second premise that you have is that there is no alternative to geoengineering in the form of ecosystem management. What I've missed here is a video message from Achim Steiner at the beginning saying that there are so many things we should be doing in order to keep carbon in the natural ecosystems, to improve the ability of natural ecosystems to sequester carbon. We should protect the kelp forests in the sea, make sure that we put water back into our drained wetlands and do other things because they can absorb enormous quantities of carbon at negative cost. The benefits outweigh the very low cost of these measures. So again, that is something that is somehow premised out of the debate at this point, but if you put geoengineering into the wider climate debate, you need to look at those two issues at least. Thank you.
I should point out that there is actually a session starting, well, pretty soon actually, I think, on biogenic carbon storage. There's also, incidentally, I think one starting at the same time about climate emergencies. So if you are enthused by either of these subjects, we won't mind if you slope off in about 20 minutes. But until then, I'm actually going to ask, I skipped over Olaf badly, and then I'm going to take two more questions, you, sir, and then Dan. But Olaf, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow, so I'm just getting on to Rafe's comment. I'm not arguing that, or my argument wasn't that we shouldn't research geoengineering. It was more the opposite. We should research the politics of geoengineering as well, because there are side effects, not just physical side effects, potentially to various kinds of geoengineering, but there are also potential political side effects. And just as I think we should research the physical, geophysical side effects of them, I also think we should be at least pay some attention to what the political side effects of deploying various kinds of technologies are, especially if you're imagining them to go hand in hand with mitigation for many years to come, which almost everybody says, yes, we might need geoengineering, but it will definitely be in conjunction with a serious effort on mitigation. So I just don't want to make it even more difficult for ourselves if we overlook something quite fundamental, that if we change the rules of the game in a way that that doesn't serve our purposes.
Okay.
Just wanted to make the comment that if you study the evolution of governance, it usually doesn't just spring out with a major international agreement which sort of covers all the things that need to be done. I mean, certainly that isn't the way the Framework Convention on Climate Change occurred. It evolved through a whole series of processes and out of existing international organisations. And the same is true of this bit of proposals to deal with climate change. Already it's being fought out in the arenas of the Biodiversity Convention, the London Dumping Convention. Potentially it could be brought out under the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. It is being, the IPCC is part of the international structure in dealing with climate change, and it is being fought out in the IPCC, and there are likely to be further developments about what or should not be dealt with. It's being fought out in the academies of science as to what their attitude should be, and so on. It's unlikely to appear as a fully shaped response, and it couldn't be, because so much of geoengineering, inverted commas, or climate engineering is notional at this point. It will come out in the face of specific proposals. I just need to remind us that those proposals may not come under the banner of geoengineering. Where it's convenient, because geoengineering seems like a good way to attract great funds, because this is a new, terrific new field, then it may well be advanced that way, like nanotechnology was, where the risks become of concerns more likely to be offered in terms of the specific intervention, in the way that Ken Caldera was arguing we should earlier in the conference.
I should also say I've been neglecting to encourage people to say who they are. You don't absolutely have to, but it just avoids people having to say that bloke who spoke 2 times ago when they're referring back. So if you want to say who you are, that'd be great. Dan, why don't you say who you are?
Hi, Dan Bodansky. Is this on? Okay. Dan Bodansky, Arizona State University. So I guess I would start with the politics of the climate change problem and then move to politics of geoengineering. If politics are about processes to make decisions, politics of climate change are incredibly difficult. I mean, that's why we've had so few decisions over the last 25 years, for all of the kinds of reasons that political scientists have been analyzing. The politics of geoengineering are not great either. That's why we've had so little action on geoengineering as well. But I'd say the politics of geoengineering are easier just because you don't need to get political will in as many different places as you do with climate change. It's a different kind of problem structure. So the politics are easier somewhat on geoengineering. Now that's either good or bad depending on whether you think that geoengineering is potentially a benefit or not. But it is an easier politics with geoengineering because it's going to be easier to get decisions because it only requires one or a small number of countries to act. I guess I think the politics of climate change are so bad that I don't really see. I think it's just sticking your head in the sand to say we're going to solve the problem through mitigation. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that in the next 10 or 20 years there's some transformation and mitigation actually solves it. But having been participating in the climate change negotiations now for over 20 years, I just think that is sticking your head in the sand to expect that transformation. So it seems to me if you're actually concerned about the climate change problem, one does need to be looking at other alternatives. And so research to figure out if there is another alternative, I don't know if there is or not, is a prudent course of action. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and putting your eggs in a basket that has not been going well so far seems to be imprudent. Thanks.
I think, Duncan, you wanted to come back then, and then there was a question from the back there, which we'll go to next. But Duncan, I'm not quite sure what you wanted to respond to.
Couple of points stimulated mainly by Andreas's comments on mitigation that Dan's taken up. I mean, I think we tend to fail to recognise that the economic systems of mitigation have tipping points in them in the way that climate systems have or may have. And I think you're very right to highlight that we may reach that. We then have a judgment about whether there are pathways to respond to climate change that are different to the ones that we perceive at the moment. They're not likely to be perfect, Dan, I agree, but I think there may be ones with more justice in them, even if they don't protect the American way of life. So that would be an interesting thought. As a result, I think governance of climate engineering has to be seen as an emergent process, has to emerge from understanding those different politics and engaging in those. And Isaac, if that was your name at the back, I'm sorry, I don't think there is any reason to preset the objectives of governance from a perspective of today's view of climate engineering. We have to find venues which are fair and open and politically can possibly work in which the objectives of that governance process can be knocked out. Otherwise, we're prejudicing the whole case.
Yeah, I'm picking up from our various panelists a certain sort of like institutions first approach there. Was that what you were going to speak to?
Sorry, that's not institutions first. That's governance as something much wider, and process and politics that allows you to actually set objectives.
And so your reaction to the question, what do you actually want to do, is that that's actually not the question. The question is, how do you reach equitable ways to make those decisions, yeah? Olaf, were you going to speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just respond to Dan's point. I think it's an absolutely central premise in a lot of geoengineering discussions that it is easier politically. It's one of the major selling points. I think a lot of CDR methods are not substantially different from the mitigation problem. And secondly, mitigation has to happen in parallel. We all agree on that, I think. So maybe it's burying our head in the sand that we could ever do it, but we have to keep on trying to do it, even if we're doing geoengineering. And then the geoengineering methods that seem to be exempt from the burden sharing problem, which has dogged mitigation, I just think we're being very hasty in saying that they won't have some other kind of political problem. I mean, you could turn it around and say that it has some disadvantages compared to mitigation. It's a lot more risky in some ways than building different kinds of energy systems. It has a different quality to it and symbolic quality to it that makes it politically much more explosive in a way. So there are.
Gentleman who's been waiting there.
Sorry, good afternoon. I'm LP.
So just say, please feel free. I'm not singling out Alan here, but if you want to move to another session, they will be starting fairly soon. So.
My session starts in 10 minutes.
And you're actually chairing it. Which one's that?
I'm not emergencies. But
emergencies, right.
No, I'm from the Philippines. I just would like to offer a different developing contribute to what Professor Bodansky said, that the problem in the UNFCCC is complex. I think it's fairly simple. It's just countries, developed countries, refusing to honor their commitments in the UNFCCC, refusing to do mitigation. And I hope that the presentation in the opening session of this conference, where historical responsibility was clearly pointed out, should be the ultimate fact that should convince. But I don't know, that's the politics of it, the refusal of developed countries to follow through on their commitments back in Rio. That's why this discussion, for me, first time to listen to this discussion, I think you're creating a manufactured problem. The problem is simple. You have to do mitigation. Perhaps I may ask you, because of your much vaunted technical scientific capability, would it be possible for you to focus your efforts instead on how to deliver technology to developing countries for them to enable to cope with the problems of climate change? Because that's the problem right now. And I think nothing, I can also speak as a member of the advisory board of the Climate Technology Center of the UNFCCC. No one is giving actually clear support from developed countries to the problems, to the funding problem. So would it be possible for you to refocus instead your efforts rather than looking at this, for me, this debate on GE, CE is sterile because it is divorced from the reality of poor, the women, the indigenous peoples. This is a manufactured problem. And I mean, it's pathetic to see all white males, I can say any woman or indigenous person discussing, and I think I heard someone say that a small group of countries can go through this, can solve this. I think that's a pretty arrogant thing to say, that a small group of countries can solve the problems of the world.
I think that's not quite what Eduardo, if you'd like to, would you like
anyway,
to, that
sorry,
really wasn't,
so maybe
I think, what you were saying.
No? Don't worry, but anyway, I just want to make a point that perhaps you should zero in on what's the real problem. So developed countries should man up, so to speak, no? Follow through on their commitments, not raise many complicated issues. Focus on the commitments, because that has been the problem of the UNFCCC. Developed countries not really living up to their commitments. So that's the developing country view. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think, I wonder to what extent that's a question, though, of, I'm not sure what the political response, I mean, as you say, that's exactly what Dan was talking about. That is the position that hasn't changed.
I just want to offer a developing
Okay.
view because the view that the problem is complex might be the mean that will be accepted, but in fact the debate is simple.
Okay, I'm taking the mood of the room. I'm going to ask Axel to sum things up because he's had his hand up longest among the panel. Axel.
Yeah, well, I would say that one needs to be very careful. We've heard the perspective, okay, classical mitigation is getting cheaper and therefore the climate engineering need is less pressing. On the other side, of course, we see that CDR technologies are much more expensive than classical mitigation. For example, if we look into the carbon markets, it's clear that the technical CDR has not gone anywhere because it's not competitive with other technologies. So the big question is, of course, is SRM able to make really that big difference? We don't know yet whether all the economic forecasts about the very low cost of SRM are true or not. We need much more research on that. That's also research which is probably not as dangerous as many people think because this is theoretical research. It doesn't require direct experiments, at least not for getting the cost estimates for the different components. And then I would expect that the debate becomes much less climate engineering versus all the rest, but becomes relevant for technology-specific discussions. And I think once we've reached this level of technology-specific discussion, then also this question whether climate engineering is such a different topic that it needs all its specific suite of politics will evaporate, and it will become like adaptation policy currently is a mainstream of UNFC discussions. Also, some climate engineering technologies will become mainstream in the climate policy discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a slight feeling that people who want to go have all gone, but feel free to prove me wrong. I'm going to then say thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for coming. If you do want to discuss the Steve Rayner statement thing, back here at 5 o'clock. Thank you very much.